Before her disappearance, 17-year-old Zion Foster sent a final message indicating she was on her way home. She had informed her mother and boyfriend that she was going out that night with her favorite cousin, a regular outing she enjoyed at least twice a month. However, when her mother reached out to her cousin the following day for assistance in locating Zion, he provided some shocking news. He claimed he hadn't seen or spoken to her in years. On January 5, 2022, Sierra Milton, a mother of 6, woke up to a troubling reality. Her eldest daughter, Zion Foster, hadn't returned home the night before. At 17 years old, Zion was a 12th grader at East Detroit High School, having just celebrated her birthday in November. Like many teenagers, she had gone through a rebellious phase. In fact, she had threatened to run away from home and had actually done so twice the previous year. Frustrated with her mother's rules at just 16, she had sought refuge at her grandmother's house. But after a few days, she felt compelled to leave again. This time, her sudden disappearance caused enough alarm for Sierra to involve the police, but it turned out to be yet another false alarm. Throughout this tumultuous period, Zion struggled with the weight of a recent cancer diagnosis in her family and her growing desire for independence. On that January morning, things felt different for Zion. The previous night, she had completed her shift at the Detroit Wing Company and returned home. She candidly asked permission to leave the house, explaining that she would be spending time with her favorite cousin, Jalen. With the added stress of her grandmother's recent cancer diagnosis and her own yearning for independence, Sierra reluctantly agreed, watching Zion walk out the door just before 11 p.m. However, the next day brought worry. The 17-year-old's boyfriend, Vertez Gonzalez, a fellow high school student, messaged Sierra, asking if she had heard from Zion. He expressed concern as he could no longer reach her. The last text he received from Zion was sent at 12:59 a.m., which simply said OMW, indicating she was on her way. But Zion never made it home, and attempts to call her went straight to voicemail. Throughout the night, messages were sent, but none were received. Finally, at 8:10 a.m., Vertez sent a message asking, "Are you alive?" This only deepened the growing anxiety surrounding Zion. At 12:59 a.m., he received a text from Zion that simply read, OMW, indicating she was on her way. However, Zion never arrived home. Throughout the night, calls to her phone consistently went straight to voicemail, and text messages sent went unanswered. By 8:00 a.m., the worry intensified, prompting him to send a frantic message asking, "Are you alive?" The situation was further complicated by a response Sierra received from her cousin, Jalen Brazier. In stark contrast to what Sierra's daughter had claimed, Jalen stated that he had not been with Zion the previous night. This revelation raised questions in Sierra's mind. How often had Zion asserted she spent time with Jalen? She recalled that Zion had mentioned it occurred once or twice a month. He then replied to her message in frustration. Zion's deceptive behavior was clever yet risky. Jalen questioned why she would fabricate stories about spending time at his house, suggesting she might actually be with someone who lived nearby. It was revealed that Zion shared her location with her boyfriend Vertez, and on that particular night at 11:24 p.m., her phone's tracking showed her just across the street from Jalen's home. Feeling insecure in their relationship, Vertez had taken a screenshot of her location at that exact time. Jalen speculated that Zion was potentially using him as a cover while she was really at a neighbor's house, implying she must have connections with someone else on the street or close by. Jalen suggested that Sierra contact the police for assistance, although he asked to remain uninvolved. Meanwhile, Vertez was not easily dissuaded. He bombarded Jalen with messages. He confronted the 23-year-old, brandishing the screenshot from his phone. In response to this confrontation, Jalen sent a video from his Ring camera system, demonstrating that there were no recorded entries indicating that Zion had ever been at the house. He asserted that she had never been there. However, the East Point police were not prepared to act on Sierra's missing persons report with any urgency, citing her history as a runaway, according to her distraught mother. The officers at the station were straightforward in their assessment. The supervising officer explicitly stated that, "To be honest, we are treating this situation as a case of her being a runaway." With little support from law enforcement, her family took matters into their own hands. They launched a search effort for Zion, enlisting the help of family and friends. In the days that followed, they posted flyers, held rallies, and spoke to the media, urging, "We need your eyes." "The police need your help," they emphasized, rallying the community. In the meantime, officers were eventually dispatched to speak with Jalen Brazier, who was Zion's self-professed favorite cousin. It turned out that Jalen was also closely related to her former stepfather, as he was a cousin to Sierra's ex-husband. At 23, he was a father to two young children and had a long-term partner named Katrina. Jalen Brazier, who was in a long-term relationship with his girlfriend, Katrina Smith, was found at home when the officers arrived. Despite Sierra's belief that her daughter and Jalen had always stayed close, Jalen claimed they hadn't spoken in years. He acknowledged the officers with a casual greeting, saying, "How you doing?" and "What's up, Mr. Brazier?" to which he responded with a respectful, "Yes, sir." When the officers asked for his girlfriend's name, he confirmed it was Katrina. They informed Jalen that they were there regarding his cousin Zion. Jalen invited them in to inspect the house, sharing that he had last seen Zion nearly a year ago, in May 2021. He further explained that it was Zion's mother and her boyfriend who appeared to be fixated on the notion that Zion had been with him that night. Jalen even offered to show the officers the footage from his Ring camera, which he mentioned could also be shared with Sierra. When she reviewed the footage, Zion's mother noticed that there were gaps in the entries for the night of January 4th, indicating that some of it had been deleted. The East Point police, upon searching the house, found nothing suspicious and reported no signs that Zion had been there. Meanwhile, Jalen expressed his frustrations about being drawn into the conflict instigated by a cousin whom he rarely interacts with. He emphasized how uncomfortable he felt, especially since it was clear that the girl had never been in his home. Jalen recounted incidents where he had tried to clarify the situation, stating that he was simply trying to demonstrate that the accusations were unfounded and that his privacy was being invaded. "Yes, I assume you would be aware of that. There's nothing quite like having another job. It's hard to believe she wouldn't share the necessary information with you. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your night, everyone." While Jalen might have deceived the East Point police, he couldn't fool Sierra Milton. She was indeed vigilant, keeping an eye on who her daughter left with from the house. In fact, she often greeted Jalen herself when he came by to pick her up. She was well aware of his deceit. Jalen claimed he hadn't seen or been in contact with her for the last 3 years, which isn't possible, given that he was standing in my driveway and even gave me a hug. The simplest way to verify if Zion had been across the street from her cousin's place, as indicated by her location data, to verify the location data indicating that Zion had been across the street from her cousin's house, a practical approach was to review the neighbor's doorbell cameras. At approximately 11:15 p.m. on January 4th, a white sedan, which was known to be driven by Jalen Brazier, was recorded entering his driveway. Two individuals were clearly visible emerging from the vehicle and walking into the house, one male and one female. Earlier, Jalen had driven Katrina to work just before 11 p.m. that night, as she was on the midnight shift at a manufacturing job that lasted from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Therefore, the second individual who entered the house at 11:15 could not have been Katrina, as phone location data would later validate that the pair captured entering the home were Jalen Brazier and Zion Foster. Notably, the camera footage did not show Zion leaving the premises. At 1 a.m., the same camera positioned across the street recorded Jalen pulling his car out of the driveway before reversing it back in. After a few minutes, the vehicle left the premises, only to return less than 10 minutes later. A subsequent search warrant was issued for both the house and the car. While the search inside the house yielded nothing of interest, the contents of the car were meticulously cataloged and examined. No definitive evidence surfaced to clarify Zion's fate. This changed when law enforcement introduced cadaver dogs, which notably indicated interest in the trunk of Jalen's car. On January 19th, Jalen, accompanied by a friend who was a lawyer, voluntarily met with detectives. It became evident that Jalen had fabricated his account of being with Zion on the night of her disappearance. He stepped forward to present what he described as a truthful recounting of events from that evening. Jalen stated that he picked Zion up from her home and brought her back to his place, where he put his two children, boys aged 1 and 2, to bed. After that, he joined Zion in the living room. During their time together, they were relaxing, with Jalen recalling, "You guys make sure we leave. You're just watching TV and chilling." Zion began to share details about her life, including her family relationships, her boyfriend, her job, and her efforts to secure an apartment. She conveyed that things were much better for her than the last time they had spoken. Jalen mentioned that they had smoked some marijuana, which seemed to make Zion very drowsy. He noticed her head start to tilt back as if she were about to doze off while sitting upright on the couch. At that moment, he decided to step into the other room to pour himself a drink. When he returned, he found Zion looking exhausted and saying she was tired. He observed her leaning her head back, so he told her it was fine to sleep for a bit. After about 15 to 20 minutes, he checked in on her asking, "Are you good? Are you ready to go home?" But she didn't respond at all. He wondered if their plan had been to head back home. Jalen reported that his young cousin Zion's pulse was faint, and then he described her heartbeat as non-existent. He realized in shock that she had simply died on his couch. Instead of calling 911, panic set in as he grappled with the situation, not knowing how she had passed. Jalen feared that it would seem as though he was responsible for her death. He noted that everything was growing very faint, and the reality of the situation felt surreal and overwhelming. Feeling the weight of the moment, he muttered to himself, "This looks terrible, and I don't know what to do." In a moment of desperation, he placed her in a position where he thought she might be found and ended up taking her to Highland Park. He hastily concealed her inside some trash cans on the island. Detectives later questioned Jalen about how he knew Zion was dead. He explained that she had abruptly stopped breathing, leaving him in a state of disbelief and confusion. She had very suddenly stopped breathing. I leaned back on the couch, wondering if she was still alive. Maybe the devil had a hand in this. She was probably just high or something. You know, when you start to panic, you shake her. But despite your efforts, she doesn't wake up. And when you check her pulse, you realize she's not breathing at all. At that moment, what do? You start freaking out. Yeah, it's terrifying. You've been in shock the entire time. At that point, we all thought she was definitely dead. But was she really dead? Or did she just have a faint pulse? She wasn't breathing, was she? There was nothing happening at that point. You know the difference between being dead and alive, right? Do you think she was dead? She wasn't breathing, which suggests she might have been alive. Assuming there was no detectable heartbeat and no response from her body, I would conclude that she was indeed dead. I need you to demonstrate this clearly, as I want to avoid any confusion. We need to confirm whether she's still there, and if she isn't, we must take the necessary steps to locate her. Are you okay with that? Jalen led detectives to the dumpsters in Highland Park, where he claimed he had left Zion's body weeks earlier. He recounted that Zion had been at his home for about 2 hours before she died, placing her time of death at just after 1 a.m. Cell phone records indicated that her device dropped off the network at 1 a.m., aligning with the moment she ceased responding to messages from Pertez. Jalen claimed to detectives that he had not deleted any data from his phone since the night Zion died. However, they discovered he had performed a full factory reset on his device just 2 days later, which erased all the information it contained. Despite this, investigators managed to piece together the movements of his phone, which placed Jalen at the dumpsters in Highland Park at 1:48 a.m. There was, however, no trace of Zion left there, and the dumpster was already open. Did you close it? Yes, I closed it. Where did you park your car? Right by it, right in front of it. I came from there, sir. So you parked right in front of it? Yes, right in front. Did you back into it or pull forward? We were side by side, okay? He said, my baby just died, and then added that he threw her in a dumpster, treating her like trash. When Jalen returned for a follow-up interview the next day, January 20th, inconsistencies in his story began to surface. He now stated that the two had taken acid that night, suggesting it was her reaction to the psychedelics that must have caused her heart to stop. This explanation was just as dubious as his earlier claim that marijuana had been responsible for her death. The detective sought to exploit these newly emerged claims in an effort to elicit a confession. Perhaps Jalen intended to use the drugs as a rationale for his actions, specifically for whatever he did to cause his younger cousin's death. I was experimenting with psychedelic acid, he stated. I think that's what ultimately led to her demise. Did you ever experience that disorienting moment where you didn't know what you were doing? Jalen quickly dismissed the idea, insisting, No. She also posed a risk to herself. The detective pressed further. Let me ask you this. The issue with those drugs is that when you're at home, you might lose track of your actions. Isn't that why people take them? Did you do something while you were inebriated? He inquired again, trying to piece together the puzzle. Again, I'm trying to make sense of this. The conversation seemed to take a turn towards the logical. That actually would make a lot of sense, Jalen replied. When you dropped the acid, did you feel a rush of confidence? I'm not suggesting it's okay, but I was fully confident in that moment. However, I'm unsure of how it affected her, at least. I know it alters your mindset significantly, making your brain react in ways you wouldn't typically expect. It's all starting to make sense to me now. This whole situation. Do you understand? I'm sitting here trying to comprehend how someone like young guy Jay could ever cause harm. But it does make sense to me now. It's not Jay, it's not about him. At that moment, you realize that, right? If anything happened while you were under the influence, I need to know that because it makes a big difference. Despite efforts to gather a confession, the detective was unsuccessful. Without the admission and the location of Zion, there was insufficient evidence to proceed with a murder indictment. As a result, Jalen was arrested and charged with one count of lying to the police, having intentionally misled them about Zion Foster's whereabouts and her well-being. In June of that year, Jalen spoke with detectives again. This time, only the audio was recorded, and he altered his narrative yet again. He retracted his earlier statement that he and Zion had taken acid that night, asserting that this part of his account was false. Along with Jalen's main confession, he altered several smaller details in his story. Previously, he had described Zion as passed out on the couch, but he now claimed she was on the floor. He indicated that he felt pressured by the police to provide more information, which led him to fabricate a more intricate narrative to satisfy their inquiries. Additionally, he mentioned that the LSD had initially come from both turkey-headed LSD, suggesting that it must have affected her differently or caused some adverse reaction. There were moments of uncertainty in his recollection, leaving one to wonder about the truth of his statements. Meanwhile, garbage collection trucks in Highland Park were tracked to specific areas in local landfills. The Herculean task of sifting through mountains of waste accumulated over several weeks from the Detroit area was no small feat. An estimated 8-week project commenced, involving dozens of volunteers primarily clad in hazmat suits and masks, who were assisted by heavy machinery. They painstakingly sifted through layer upon layer of the landfill, systematically searching for any trace of Zion. We anticipate that the first phase will take about 2 weeks to complete, and while we understand that complete closure may never be possible, we are committed to doing what is right for the right reasons. Our goal is to bring some measure of closure and justice to this family. Meanwhile, Jalen Brazier faced the prospect of up to 4 years in prison for the falsehoods he shared with the police. The Detroit Police Department, aided by the FBI, continued their efforts to secure a murder warrant against him. During his sentencing, Jalen addressed the judge saying, "Yes, I did turn myself in. I lied, but I wasn't in the right state of mind. There was no way for me to prepare for a situation like that. I was terrified." He continued to explain the confusion surrounding the incident. "I don't know exactly how she passed or what caused her to pass. One moment she was fine, and the next she was gone. I did not cause it. I just didn't know what to do in that panic. I have never felt anything like it in my life." He described the overwhelming fear and regret he felt, remarking, "You think, how could I just dispose of her like that? That wasn't my choice." Ultimately, he was left feeling lost and paralyzed, unsure of how to act in such a tragic moment. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, about 10 minutes, overwhelmed and unsure of what to do. Who should I call? My kids are upstairs, and we had just fought for 2 years to finally settle into this place, only for everything to start falling apart. I wish I could turn back time. If I could, I would have called an ambulance immediately and reached out to her mom, who is just so sweet. I felt a strong urge to do something, anything. Yet I realized that nobody else understands the situation, the confusion and urgency. At the very least, I hoped that everything would turn out okay, that this incident could be confirmed and understood, allowing everyone to find some peace. But then I learned about Jalen Brazier, who had been sentenced to 23 months in prison, adding another layer of complexity to our lives. While in custody, Jalen's phone calls home to his girlfriend Katrina and other family members were closely monitored. He occasionally tried to use a fellow inmate's calling code to maintain some level of privacy in his conversations, though this was ultimately an ineffective attempt. Additionally, he possessed a prohibited cell phone, which he used to exchange thousands of messages with Katrina. During his phone calls, Jalen frequently inquired if anything significant had occurred. This seemed to reflect a subtle effort on his part to ascertain whether the extensive search of the landfill had yielded any updates on the investigation. The implication was clear. If nothing major had surfaced, it suggested a lack of new developments. Jalen's repeated reassurances to Katrina to keep your head up revealed his concern and unease about the situation, hinting at a deeper sense of anxiety over the ongoing search for Zion. "Stop talking, I understand," she said, sensing Jalen's distress about the search for Zion. His worries were evident, and if his account was accurate, that she had died suddenly from an unknown, nonviolent cause, then it was only natural for him to hope for her discovery. Finding Zion could potentially clear him of any suspicion, and the sooner, the better. It was appropriate for a caring cousin to wish for her safe return. Interestingly, he repeatedly expressed relief that no significant updates had emerged from the search as the final days of the landfill project approached. He even likened the efforts to a search for COVID, and one could see a strange analogy there. Jalen had served just over 9 months after being granted early release, he participated in a special 90-day incarceration program. This boot camp, resembling a military training regimen, allows inmates convicted of certain offenses to improve themselves while serving time. In return for their efforts, participants are often rewarded with the possibility of early release. However, it had been nearly a year, and Zion had yet to be located. No indictment for murder had been sought, and now the prime suspect had returned to his home and family. Questions arose. Why was this man free? What could I admit to and still remain unpunished? Jalen Brazier's taste of freedom was fleeting. On June 13th of 2023, after a year and a half of investigation, the DPD were finally granted a warrant for his arrest. The 24-year-old would face charges for second-degree murder as well as tampering with evidence. Upon his arrest for Zion's murder, investigators seized 2 additional cell phones, despite their factory reset. Upon his arrest for the murder of Zion, Jalen Brazier, a 24-year-old, would face serious charges, including second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. In the course of the investigation, authorities seized 2 additional cell phones from him. Even though one of the devices had undergone a factory reset, investigators managed to recover significant information. They found that Jalen's search history, which had been stored in the cloud, revealed several concerning inquiries made shortly after the crime. On January 7th, just 3 days after he disposed of his cousin's body in a dumpster, he conducted a series of Google searches, including queries like, "Are garbage trucks also compactors?" and "What is the force of a garbage truck compactor?" Additionally, he looked up questions such as, "How do police get your phone history?" and "How do you know if police are watching you?" This series of incriminating searches would further complicate his legal troubles. In addition to these incriminating searches, investigators discovered that, in the months leading up to the incident, Jalen had conducted a series of disturbingly suggestive searches for pornographic content. Notably, many of these searches included the terms cousin and step-cousin, some of which were not only graphic in nature, but also reportedly very violent. As the case approached trial, a preliminary hearing provided further insights into the additional evidence that had come to light since Jalen's release. This hearing may have presented Jalen's defense team with a new potential theory regarding the case. He testified that he believed his girlfriend was regularly taking medication for epilepsy. He recounted that Zion informed him she experienced seizures, which intensified and became more frequent without her medication. On one occasion, Vertiz witnessed Zion momentarily faint, slouching forward before quickly regaining her composure after a few seconds. He speculated that this incident could have been a seizure. When asked if he had ever seen her have a seizure, he replied, I think so, yes." He was prompted to explain what happened during the episode, stating, "I mean, it was just like a little pass out, that's it. Just a quick little moment." When asked if she was foaming at the mouth during a seizure, he responded, "No, okay," indicating it was simply a brief fainting spell. While on the toilet, she experienced shaking, but it was only for a brief moment before she passed out entirely. Sierra Milton, whose youngest child was diagnosed with a similar condition, asserted that this was not the case. In fact, Zion had never endured a seizure, as supported by hundreds of pages of medical records documenting years of treatment. Despite this, Jalen Brazier's account of the events is now being scrutinized in a new light, considering the possibility that Zion's condition may have contributed to her tragic death. This incident occurred suddenly in his living room, raising questions about whether she indeed experienced a seizure. Only two individuals can provide the truth about what transpired within the house that night. One of the individuals involved is Zion, who is tragically no longer with us. The other key figure is the defendant, whose account of the events has proven to be inconsistent. Notably, nearly every time he recounted what transpired, details of his story shifted. Despite his efforts to dispose of Zion's body, he left behind a significant trail of digital evidence that reveals crucial information. This evidence suggests that all indications point to only one plausible conclusion regarding why Zion was found in the trunk of his car that night. He murdered her. On that particular day, Zion had gone to Jalen's house, and they were smoking together. She had a history of seizures and was taking medication to manage her condition. At one point, Jaden informed the police that Zion was experiencing shallow breathing and had a faint heartbeat. After checking for signs of life, she discovered that the girl was dead. Jalen, under the influence of drugs, an activity that remains federally illegal, began to panic, fearing he might be held responsible for the tragic situation. Meanwhile, Zion's phone lost network connection at 1:00 a.m. on the same night that she went missing, effectively rendering it lost alongside her. In contrast, a different device belonging to the teenager was safely back at home. Sierra Milton later submitted this phone to the police, who found that it contained months of correspondence between her and her favorite cousin. The messages varied from subtly disturbing to outright inappropriate, with some being sexually explicit. Authorities retrieved over 4,000 distinct texts from Zion's previous device. Within these texts, Jalen frequently extended invitations for her to visit his home while his girlfriend was away. He offered to provide shelter in his basement if she decided to run away from home, and even suggested ways for her to avoid being caught by the police. At one point, he insinuated that others perceived them as a couple, stating that Katrina, the mother of his children, was envious of her. He followed up these remarks by questioning if that seemed crazy to her, as if seeking her validation. Throughout their correspondence, Ryan Elsey, the Wayne County Assistant Prosecutor, characterized the messages as pervasive, at times praising her intelligence and looks, but also probing in an immature manner. Jalen went on to boast to Zion about how effortlessly he could attract women. At one point, he proclaimed himself a god. Prosecutor Elsey concluded by addressing the jury, detailing how the 23-year-old had been grooming his younger cousin for years. She revealed that he harbored fantasies about her, and on January 4th, he acted on his impulses. This was the disturbing motive that led to her tragic death. Jurors learned how Jalen found out that Katrina was pregnant with their third child on the same day he brought Zion to his house. Messages exchanged between the couple revealed his deception regarding his activities after dropping her off at work earlier that day. Following a trip to the emergency room due to her nausea and hot spells, she continued to experience these symptoms hours later and messaged him repeatedly. Katrina felt too unwell to stay at work, so she reached out to Jalen to ask him to pick her up. At 1:01 a.m., she sent a message stating, "I think I need to come home." Then at 1:26 a.m., she wrote, "I don't feel good." Shortly after, she texted, "My stomach hurts," followed by, "I feel sick and keep getting hot and cold." Jalen's reply was simply, "You can make it, baby." Eventually, he did pick her up around 3:00 a.m. Upon his arrival, she noticed a deep scratch on his collarbone. When she asked about it, he claimed that the cat had scratched him deeply enough to draw blood. Katrina found it unusual, as the cat had never scratched that hard before. The trial lasted 2 full weeks in May 2024. Jalen opted not to take the stand, while the prosecution called 32 witnesses, leaving the defense without any. The case against Jalen was primarily based on circumstantial evidence, yet it proved to be quite compelling. A forensic anthropologist reviewed Zion's medical history and determined that her only condition, which could potentially have led to her death, was asthma. However, an asthma attack would manifest in a manner contrary to what her cousin described. Instead of quietly losing consciousness and having a faint heartbeat, Zion would have been gasping for air, making it evident that she was in significant distress. Pertez reiterated his testimony that Zion had confided in him about her seizures, though he also acknowledged that his girlfriend had a tendency to exaggerate her ailments. On the night of January 4th, 2000, Zion was brought to his house by Pertez, who was doing so behind the back of his pregnant girlfriend, who was at work at that time. It seemed that Zion enjoyed telling stories, and though she arrived at his place that late evening, she left in a far more troubling manner, found in the trunk of his car. This all raised questions about what may have transpired inside the house that night, particularly given the unexplained gash on Pertez's collarbone. There were claims that he resorted to those drastic measures out of fear of getting caught for marijuana, concerned about being busted for possession. One must consider the irrationality of doing something so extreme over something like that. After all, if you were to visit a marijuana dispensary, you wouldn't expect to face a serious legal consequence. There's unlikely to be a team of ATF agents ready to arrest you and send you to federal prison over that. It would be more comparable to receiving a parking ticket. Have you ever heard of someone disposing of a body just to evade a parking ticket? Vertes himself mentioned that Zion specifically told him she had a history of seizures. When asked whether he was concerned upon learning this, he replied no, as he was aware of her seizure history and the fact that she was on medication for it. He understood that without her medication, her seizures would only worsen. Sierra Milton and the rest of Zion's family waited, while the jury deliberated. There are numerous inconsistencies in this case that, hopefully, the jury will recognize. They need to see through the lies and understand the truth, that he murdered my daughter and disposed of her with utter disregard for her life. Remarkably, the jury returned with a decision in just 30 minutes. How could they find him guilty? How could they not find him guilty? As the ladies and gentlemen of the jury raised their right hands, it was clear that each member held a significant responsibility. Meanwhile, Jalen Brazier maintained his innocence during his sentencing hearing, claiming that he had no involvement in her death. I know that the pictures speak volumes, and while they reflect the painful reality of what happened, I never wanted to offer an apology that felt meaningless. It is what it is, and there's no way to change the past or bring her back. Jalen Brazier's refusal to take responsibility for his actions was evident during the proceedings. Judge Donald Knapp highlighted the convict's failure to acknowledge his guilt in the murder, his deceitful behavior towards the police, and his manipulation of family members. Despite being alone in the house, he misled and lied to those close to him, ultimately acting by himself. According to Judge Knapp, the likelihood of his rehabilitation was low. Brazier's actions contributed to significant delays in the investigation, proving that his apologies held little weight. He claimed he never tried to apologize, and these assertions were dismissed as untrue. In light of these factors, Judge Knapp announced that Jalen Brazier would be sentenced to 30 to 90 years in prison.